Hello everyone and welcome back to another video where today I want to do a little bit of a discussion type video, talking specifically about the showrunner position in Doctor Who, but not in the way that we have been previously. Obviously, if you've been keeping up with my channel, we've been doing a lot of videos talking about who could potentially be the next showrunner after Russell T Davies leaves, but that's not what I want to talk about today. What I actually want to talk about today is the idea that is the showrunner position, as it exists, actually fit for purpose for Doctor Who in the modern day? And there's a few things that kind of got me thinking about this, so I want to kind of delve into like what this job is, what the alternative could be, and why I think maybe it might be time for a change in the way that Doctor Who is ran and made. But before we get into it, subscribe if you're new, that would be greatly appreciated. We are trying to get to 40,000 subscribers by the end of the year, and any support is greatly appreciated. But with that said, let's dive right into it. So I think first of all, it's probably a good idea to outline what the Doctor Who showrunner actually does. Now, whilst the showrunner role, if you like, is relatively new to UK television, generally it means you're the big top boss at Doctor Who in this case. You essentially not only write the majority of the show, you are its core creative lead and visionary, you also are basically, overseeing the brand as a whole, and you are basically seen as basically a Kevin Feige type, but even more so because you actually write and create most of the ideas and stories and the vision for the franchise. Now, this was introduced in 2005, and has been how Doctor Who has operated since then. Obviously, we've had different men in the role, Russell T Davies, Stephen Moffat and Chris Chibnall, but this structure has more or less been unchanged since 2005. There was one attempt in Series 11 by Chris Chibnall to bring in a writer's room, but the UK media industry does not have the infrastructure for that. To do with, I think it's something to do with how we pay writers and, how credit works, basically. So the infrastructure just wasn't there for him to implement that during, I believe, Series 11. So the structure of how Doctor Who's been made has been unchanged for over 20 years now. And the thing is, pretty much all the showrunners say how much of an exhausting and, draining process being the Doctor Who showrunner is. And how basically no one wants to take on the job because of how much of a Herculean task it is, because you're not only the creative lead of a program, you're also overseeing this kind of ecosystem, this kind of brand, and you're also writing about half the scripts on average per series. It's a big job for any one person to have. But the interesting thing about it is, it's not really how Doctor Who has always worked. In fact, the classic era operated very differently. The way the classic era worked is that basically you would have a number of separate roles, i.e. you would have a producer at the top, and then you would have writers and script editors underneath them. The producer at the top would still be kind of the core creative drive of the program, who would make a lot of the executive decisions, but a lot of the other work, such as, sort of forming the way that the scripts are actually written, or, in some cases as well, by script editors and stuff, different tones could be applied, whilst also adhering to the executive producer's kind of overall vision. And that's how Classic Who operated. And I've started to wonder whether something like that, obviously maybe not exactly the same, would actually be more beneficial to Doctor Who. And I think there's a couple advantages to it, but also a couple of disadvantages. So I'm going to lay out my sort of feelings on both. So I think advantage number one would be basically what I've already said. It would basically lift a lot of pressure off of the individuals in the showrunner job, because they wouldn't be responsible for writing and basically producing the show and basically being the front man of it. They'd still be the front man, and their overall vision or kind of way they view the show would still be what was pushed forward, but in terms of how that vision was executed, that would essentially be delegated to other people. So for example, in the classic era, you would have people like John Nathan Turner as the producer, but then you would have, you'd have Andrew Cartmel, for example, in the McCoy era as script editor, and then you would have writers, who would do individual episodes, like, for example, Ben Aronovich, and so on and so forth. Whereas now, Russell T Davies writes a ton of the scripts, and is also the overall visionary for it, and is also the marketing frontman for it. Whereas in Classic Who, these roles were a lot more kind of dissected. And I also think this would lead to maybe less people having a go at the showrunner to an extent that they do, because basically any fault with Doctor Who, even if it's not down to the showrunner themselves, is pretty much always pinned on the Doctor Who showrunner, because they are seen as the head honcho, the face of any given era, so naturally anything that goes wrong, even if it has nothing to do with them, they bear that on their shoulders. Whereas with this, it would at least delegate some of that fury to other people as well. I think they would still get it. John Nathan Turner still got it, of course, in the 80s, there's no denying that. But I do at least think that it would kind of mitigate the amount of pressure we put on these individual people, and might actually make it easier for the BBC to approach people to actually work on this show. Second of all, I actually think there's something to be said for the longevity of such a model that relies on individual visions for multiple years exclusively. Obviously, we've had 3 different men running the show at this point, and I think it has led to a feeling of modern Doctor Who feeling somewhat stagnant, which you could argue Classic Who also did towards the end as well, but I would also make the case that during even, for example, the John Nathan Turner era, you would have different script editors that would give different flavours to Doctor Who while still feeling very JNT, influenced. For example, the Colin Baker era was largely done under Eric Saywood, and then you had the McCoy era that was largely done under Andrew Cartmel. And whilst those are still under the same producer, they both have very, very distinct tones and vibes to them as opposed to each other. Whereas, for example, if you look at RTD1 versus RTD2, very obviously written by the same guy. Obviously, you can say that maybe it's not as good as it used to be, but the point is that authorial voice is a lot stronger and a lot more easy to spot. In a way that with Classic Who, it all sort of flowed more creatively, I feel. This is also true as well of obviously, I've mentioned before writers coming back to Classic Who as kind of a defense for Russell T Davies coming back. For example, Robert Holmes came back several times, and in fact, one of the times he came back was to write Caves Around Rosani, which was one of the most successful stories of the classic era. However, at the same time, it's worth acknowledging, he never came back to produce or run the show. He was only there to write a one-off episode. And in that case, I think people are a lot more forgiving of that, because the overall vision being spearheaded wasn't still being done by the same people. This also led to much more organic transitions between eras as well. For example, between the Pertwee and Tom Baker eras, you would have members of the Terrence Dicks team who worked on the Pertwee era kind of helping the transition to Hinchcliffe and Holmes as well. So it would lead to a more organic transition of eras, rather than this complete hard reset thing that New Who always seems to do, which on some level works in a marketing way, but also makes it difficult to feel like you're watching one cohesive TV show, rather distinct separate entities that exist under the same umbrella, which I think can make it kind of frustrating for fans. For example, if you were a big fan of the Moffat era, one of the things that annoyed many people about the Chibnall era is how much it backpedaled on existing Moffat era ideas, whereas, for example, if we did do a more integrated approach, you could have had a more slow kind of transition into those ideas that would have felt more organic with where the show is going at that point. I think another reason as well is that it gives more people opportunities to get into the industry as well. Obviously, by opening up more positions, you're effectively allowing more people to get their start in certain areas. Andrew Cartmel, at the time he was brought on as script editor, was a relatively young upstart, and, went on to be, in my opinion, one of the best script editors of Doctor Who's entire history. I absolutely adore the McCoy era, and I adore Cartmel's work. And I think that those risks can't happen as much when you're putting all of these things, all of these kind of jobs, all of this kind of pressure onto one guy. And obviously, before anyone says, I am aware that there are other producers on Doctor Who and stuff, but it's still not quite the same as what it was in classic Doctor Who. The buck still stops with the showrunner in modern Doctor Who, no doubt about it. But let's talk about some of the negatives of this approach, because there are some negatives. I don't want to paint it like this would just be the perfect answer to Doctor Who's problems. The main one being tension between creatives. One of the examples I mentioned earlier being Eric Saywood being script editor under John Nathan Turner would cause increasing tension. For example, John Nathan Turner really wanted to cast Colin Baker, but by all accounts it seemed that Eric Saywood was never really that on board with that as a casting decision, and would kind of sort of deliberately somewhat sabotage that era as a result of it. So stuff like that could lead to more, friction, more creative differences, and potentially a more arduous production in that way. The other thing is kind of the inverse argument to what I said earlier about there not feeling like these big kind of random jumps between eras. The complete reset of an era is actually a key marketing strategy for Doctor Who. Whenever a new era starts, it's a great way to refresh it. Whereas if we did these more transitional moves, it might make the show feel more like just another season of Doctor Who, as opposed to this is a brand new, bold vision for the show that I think the show somewhat relies on to re-engage perhaps lapsed viewers. Because it's worth saying that even though I made the point that the Cartmel and John Nathan Turner era is very different, for example, to the JNT and Saywood era, the general public didn't really know that. Do you know what I'm saying? Whereas with a new showrunner and with a new Doctor, there's the kind of this thing of, oh, it's completely different people. Whereas in Classic Who, it wasn't really in quite the same way. People would be chopped and changed more frequently, but that would also lead to it not feeling as big of a deviation in between eras necessarily. I mean, this would even be true of Doctors, right? Where you'd had basically 3 producers working under one Doctor. That's unheard of in the modern day, but what that does potentially lead to, even though I do like the idea of a Doctor going between showrunners, it does potentially lead to the idea of stagnation, creative, and, kind of in the way that the show is perceived by the public. So that is a negative as well. But I do think, on the whole, I think there's more benefits than negatives to approaching more of a Classic Who-esque style system. As much as I think the showrunner role was right in 2005, where you needed a visionary to come in and go, this is what Doctor Who is in the modern day, we need to give it a kick and a scream. I think now, what the show needs more than anything is stability. It needs to be something that is reliably, good and enjoyable without, having to constantly swap and change, head guys every couple of years. And I almost think this approach would allow for more people to stay on longer, but also allow for those new creators to come in as well, just in a more controlled environment perhaps, and in an environment where there isn't this kind of mad rush every couple of years of, oh my god, who's going to run Doctor Who? We're screwed, guys, we're screwed, there's no one else to run it. It would allow them more time, it would allow them more breathing room, and potentially make for a more stable and consistent show. Like, each era in Classic Who does feel like it follows organically from one to the next, in a way that I don't think New Who really does, and I think in large part that's because there wasn't such a concerted thing of, this one guy is the visionary now for this couple of years, and that's going to be completely different. It was more, I am going to build upon what the previous people did, or in some cases, keep on some of the previous people, whilst also, employing some of my own ideas as well, which made it feel more organic, whilst also having a level to which, obviously, JMT is very different from, Hinchcliffe and Holmes, and etc., or Verity Lambert. They all have their own flavour, but it doesn't feel as much like this is a completely new show, and if you don't like it, then you just have to wait and see what else there is. So I think there is an argument to be made there as well. But let me know what you guys think. This is just something I wanted to discuss, because it's been on my mind for a while. Do you agree with me that maybe kind of going back to a more Classic Who style approach would be beneficial for the show? Do you think that's even feasible in the way that Doctor Who is currently produced? Whatever your thoughts are, drop them down in the comments below. This was more just a fun discussion than anything else, but if you did enjoy the video, be sure to like, subscribe if you're new, and I will see you later.